Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese parachute forces launched an assault on the island of Sumatra. This occurred months before the U.S. entry into World War II, as Japan was preparing for a comprehensive invasion across the Pacific. Japan's survival hinged on importing crucial resources like rubber, tin, iron, and, most importantly, oil. The Japanese military relied heavily on these supplies. Japan had previously gained control of Taiwan, parts of Korea, and a small section of Manchuria following victories in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. After defeating Russia, Japan seized all of Korea and further expanded its territory in Manchuria. On September 19, 1931, Japan staged an incident at a train station on the Manchurian-Korean border, using it as a pretext to invade the mineral-rich Chinese province. When the League of Nations condemned this action, Japan withdrew from the League and abandoned the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, which had limited the size of the Japanese Navy, to expand its fleet. In 1936, Japan commenced a full-scale invasion of China, and by July 1937, it had seized control of major port towns and essential raw materials. Although Japan did not conquer all of China, its aggression continued with the invasion of French Indochina in June 1940 during the Nazi occupation of France. In response, the U.S. enacted the Shipment Control Act, prohibiting the shipment of strategic minerals and chemicals to Japan. Notably, crude oil was excluded from this embargo. The signing of the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy in September 1940 further strained U.S.-Japanese relations. Hitler hoped that Japan would attack British assets in the Far East, encircling existing forces as he prepared for a European conflict. Japan planned to invade and seize the lucrative oil fields in the Netherlands East Indies, believing that the pact would offer security. The U.S. responded with an embargo on iron, copper, and brass, but did not initially ban oil exports to Japan. By spring 1941, Japan had fortified its position with a non-aggression treaty with Russia and increased troop levels in French Indochina. In response, President Franklin D. Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the U.S. and, after deliberation, imposed an embargo on crude oil. The Dutch also ceased selling oil to Japan following the American embargo. Consequently, Japan first targeted British Singapore, American forces in the Philippines, and sought to weaken the U.S. military before attempting to control the Netherlands East Indies' critical oil fields. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, along with other targets including the Philippines, Singapore, Hong Kong, Northern Malaya, Thailand, Guam, Wake Island, and Midway. Concurrently, preparations were underway for the invasion of Sumatra, which included nearby oil refineries and a crucial airfield. The Japanese army began experimenting with airborne forces in December 1940. The first volunteers were trained in Ichigaya, near Tokyo, under stringent requirements. Most recruits were aged 20 to 25, with rigorous medical, psychological, and physical assessments. Training included parachute jumps from a 165-foot drop, somersaults, and leaps from various heights. Initial training took place in a Tokyo entertainment park featuring parachute drops, and further exercises included jumps from moving planes. The 1st Parachute Brigade, led by Colonel Seichi Kum, was formed with the 1st Raiding Regiment under Major Tako Tita and the 2nd Raiding Regiment under Major Tako Kimura. By January 1942, the brigade was prepared for operations, including an independent air transport group. However, on January 3, 1942, a fire on the cargo ship Makaru, carrying the 1st Raiding Regiment, forced the paratroopers to abandon ship without their gear. Stranded and exhausted on Hainan Island, the Imperial Army General Staff turned to Major Kura and his 2nd Raiding Regiment, which was still organizing. This unit, about 450 strong, departed from Kyushu on January 15 and arrived in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, by February 2. The 2nd Raiding Regiment was divided into attack groups, with the 1st Raiding Flying Regiment using various aircraft to drop troops and supplies on February 14 and 15. The 998th Sentai dropped compact cargo containers with essential supplies. Concerns about these containers being misplaced or delayed led to escort missions by Nakajima Kai-43 Oscar fighters and Kawasaki Kai-48 light bombers. The attack force moved from Cambodia to the Malay Peninsula by February 13, preparing for the assault on Palembang, the capital of Sumatra. Palembang, with a population of over 108,000, was situated 50 miles inland along the Musi River. The Dutch had built 2 oil refineries near the river and maintained military and civilian airfields. The Japanese were familiar with the P-1 airfield, but discovered the well-camouflaged P-2 airfield hidden beneath the forest canopy. Palembang was selected by the British Royal Air Force to be their Sumatra headquarters. In mid-January, as the Japanese approached, the RAF stationed 6 fighter and bomber squadrons at P-1 and P-2 airfields. These 2 refineries produced high-octane aviation gasoline, which British pilots used to conduct numerous sorties against the advancing Japanese forces. Lieutenant Colonel Inu Volsang of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army commanded the Dutch Sumatra Territorial Command, overseeing the region around Palembang, with about 110 troops from the South Sumatra Garrison Battalion and 2 outdated armored trucks guarding P-1. At P-1, there were more airmen than aircraft because Japanese attacks had destroyed more planes on the ground than there were people available. A makeshift ground defense force was assembled from 72 grounded airmen of the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF, and 3 officers of the Royal Air Force, RAF. Unfortunately, these men lacked proper training and firearms. Colonel Vogelsang commanded 8 stationary 75mm field guns and 1 static reserve infantry company in Palembang. The oil refineries were protected by a machine gun company of Dutch regulars, 2 batteries from the 6th Heavy Anti-Aircraft Regiment Royal Artillery, and 1 battery from the 35th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment Royal Artillery. These units were equipped with 16 heavy 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns and 16 40mm Bofors guns, respectively. By February 2, the Dutch had received reinforcements from Singapore, but Colonel Vogelsang still lacked sufficient anti-aircraft defenses. P-1 received a troop of the Heavy Anti-Aircraft Battery, including around 150 men equipped with 6 3.7-inch guns and 6 Bofors guns. P-2 was guarded by a small anti-aircraft battery and a contingent from the 6th Regiment. A final troop with 4 3.7-inch and 4 Bofors guns was dispatched, but the regiment's effectiveness was hindered by a sunken ship carrying most of their ammunition. Colonel Vogelsang had only 1 Royal Netherlands Navy minesweeper, the Helms Pro Patria, and 2 patrol boats, the P-38 and P-40, to help guard the Palembang riverfront and the refinery docks. These boats were tasked with opposing any Japanese advance up the river to Palembang and continuously monitored the Musi River. The Dutch, British, and local Sumatran defenders awaited the Japanese assault. The Japanese aimed to capture the refineries intact as part of their broader strategy. The plan involved landing 180 men from the 2nd Raiding Regiment under Major Kura, including the regiment headquarters group, signal unit, and rifle companies, 3.5 miles southeast of the airfield. Another group of 60 men from the 1st and 2nd platoons of the 2nd Rifle Company, commanded by Lieutenant Nobutaka Hosa, was to land west of P-1. Additionally, 60 troops from the 1st Rifle Company under Lieutenant Kiku N were to be dropped near the Shell Oil BPM facilities, and 39 men from the 3rd Platoon of the 1st Rifle Company, led by Lieutenant H.B. Wide, were to land south of the Standard Oil KPM facility. Colonel Kura and some of his staff were expected to crash land between the airfield and Palembang. Once on, the troopers were to seize the airfield and oil facilities and hold them until reinforcements arrived. An amphibious invasion by 1 battalion each from the 230th and 229th Infantry Regiments of the 38th Infantry Division would reinforce the understrength Parachute Regiment. These infantrymen were to land on barges at the mouth of the Musi River and advance toward Palembang. The only immediate reinforcements would come from the 2nd Attack Force, with 90 men from the 3rd Company expected to parachute onto P-1. On February 10, a British spy aircraft spotted the Japanese invasion convoy north of Banga Island and reported its direction toward Palembang. British forces attacked the Japanese ships multiple times, and by February 14, the Dutch, British, and local defenders were well aware of the Japanese intentions. The only operational aircraft at P-1, Hawker Hurricanes, initially escorted 2 flights of RAF bombers from P-2, preparing for attacks against the Japanese convoy. At around 8:30 a.m., Japanese transports carrying the 2nd Raiding Regiment began taking off from Malay airfields. 55 planes were en route to Sumatra. Allied observation detected the Japanese flight 100 miles from Palembang, and word was sent to P-1. Air Commander Esta Vincent, commanding one of the RAF squadrons, quickly arranged for rifles and ammunition to be issued and warned the airfield defense officer of the impending paratroop assault. Unfortunately, there were not enough firearms for everyone. Only 60 airmen were armed and ready to assist the 200 Dutch regulars defending the airstrip. Almost 3 hours later, at 11:20 a.m., Japanese planes arrived at the mouth of the Meuse River. They passed silently by outbound British bombers following the river southward without deviating from their course. British anti-aircraft guns at the refineries and airfield opened fire as the Japanese planes approached. A shell burst near a Bofors anti-aircraft gun, killing one and injuring several others. Japanese fighter aircraft strafed the area, and bombers from the 199th Sentai targeted the barracks and airfield. At 11:26 a.m., 18 transport planes descended to about 600 feet and began dropping Major Kira's 180 paratroopers southeast of the airfield. Simultaneously, 6 more transports unloaded 60 soldiers from the 1st and 2nd platoons of the 2nd Rifle Company to the west of the airfield. Above the airstrip, a flight of 15 Hurricanes and several Lockheed Hudson bombers, which had previously attacked the Japanese convoy, approached. The British pilots, low on fuel, engaged the Japanese bombers while the bombers continued toward P-2. Pilot Officer Bill Lockwood and his wingman intercepted a leading Sally bomber carrying cargo containers. Lockwood shot down the bomber and, after descending through heavy rain, followed the Meuse River back to Palembang. As they neared P-1 again, Lockwood observed white objects on the ground, indicating a Japanese paratrooper landing. His wingman fired a red flare to alert him, and they proceeded to P-2. The paratroopers dropped southeast of the airstrip found themselves in a dense, tree-covered area about 2 miles from P-1. They began advancing in small groups, with some carrying only pistols and hand grenades. Lieutenant Minoru Okamoto led a group from the 4th Rifle Company, who landed about 4 miles south of the drop zone but were delayed by a jammed door. They eventually made their way north, severing telephone lines between the town and airstrip. Despite initial aerial reconnaissance indicating level terrain, the 60 soldiers of the 1st and 2nd platoons of the 2nd Rifle Company encountered dense, 6-foot-high reeds west of the airstrip. Small groups of paratroopers, armed only with hand grenades and pistols, struggled to find their cargo containers. Lieutenant Hosa continued toward P-1 with only 2 additional men. As the Japanese aircraft departed, Dutch and British defenders held their positions, not giving the Japanese any advantage. Ground and air crew who lacked rifles used Browning machine guns from non-operational aircraft to defend their positions. As the Japanese forces intensified their assault, the defenders at P-1 were facing a grim situation. The airstrip was under relentless attack, and the Japanese paratroopers, despite their scattered and disorganized landing, began to consolidate their positions. The defenders, though initially holding their ground, were increasingly under pressure. The Dutch and British forces, despite their valiant efforts, were struggling to maintain their defenses. The Japanese paratroopers, many of whom were armed only with hand grenades and pistols, took advantage of the chaos and confusion. They engaged in fierce skirmishes with the defenders, targeting key positions and using their mobility to their advantage. Lieutenant Oki and his men, having captured an armored car and set up a blockade, managed to halt some of the reinforcements coming from Palembang. The Dutch troops and their allies, including some Australian personnel, attempted several counterattacks, but they faced significant challenges due to the effective Japanese roadblocks and the difficult terrain. The evacuation of P-1 was chaotic. Despite some successful attempts to relocate key equipment and personnel, many were either captured or forced to flee. The Japanese, seizing the opportunity, continued their assault and gradually overwhelmed the defenders. By 6 o'clock p.m., The Japanese forces had captured key positions and were closing in on the remaining defenders. The situation at the roadblock remained fluid, with skirmishes continuing as both sides engaged in desperate combat. The defenders' attempts to retake the airstrip or break through the roadblock were met with fierce resistance from the Japanese troops. The Japanese, recognizing the strategic importance of their positions, fought hard to hold their gains. As night fell, the Japanese forces had effectively secured their objectives, and the defenders were forced to retreat or surrender. The Japanese success at P1 and the surrounding areas marked a significant achievement in their campaign, despite the considerable resistance they faced. As the battle at P1 and the oil refineries raged on, the situation remained fluid and chaotic. Despite the relentless Japanese assaults and the fierce resistance from the defenders, the tide of battle shifted multiple times throughout the day. At P1, a small number of British airmen, sensing that the airfield might be under Japanese control, engaged with the Japanese paratroopers left behind to guard the airfield and the captured airfield office. After a prolonged engagement, Dutch reinforcements, including a soldier armed with a Bren gun, arrived and contributed to the overthrow of the Japanese defenders. Despite the reinforcements' efforts, by late afternoon, most of the Allied defenders had either been killed or had fled the airfield. The remaining Dutch soldiers and about 60 armed RIP, Royal Australian Air Force, members stubbornly held their positions, though they were running low on ammunition. A notable moment involved Wing Commander H.J. Maguire and Platoon Officer O.D. Cryan, who, when encountering Japanese soldiers, managed to bluff their way past them by pretending to have a larger force. They then returned to their troops and continued the defense. By 5:00 p.m., P1 was entirely empty of Allied soldiers. The remaining defenders made a hasty escape towards the north along the route leading to Jambi. At the oil refineries, Japanese paratroopers, having landed near the Shell Oil BPM facilities and Standard Oil NPM complex, faced initial success. Lieutenant Toga and his platoon quickly overran a pillbox and made their way into the residential area near the refinery. As they pressed their attack, they were joined by Lieutenant Ogawa and Lieutenant Yoko, who hoisted the Japanese flag atop the central topping tower. However, the Allies put up a fierce counter-offensive, using oil refinery air raid shelters as pillboxes and creating chaos with spill oil that caught fire. Despite intense fighting, the Dutch and British soldiers managed to reclaim much of the BPM refinery by nightfall. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Hayes' platoon, after a rough landing and initial skirmishes, managed to advance toward the refinery, but faced heavy enemy fire. The Japanese attack faltered in the absence of their captain, and Sergeant Tamba assumed command. Under the cover of darkness, Tamba's paratroopers found the refinery abandoned as the defenders had slipped away. Overall, the Japanese forces managed to secure their gains at P1 and the oil refineries, despite fierce resistance and challenging conditions. The fluid and violent nature of the engagements highlighted both the tenacity of the defenders and the aggressive tactics of the Japanese paratroopers throughout the night of February 14, 1942. As the Allied forces awaited reinforcements, Japanese soldiers from the 38th Infantry Division's 229th Infantry Regiment began disembarking from transport vessels in the Meuse River Delta. Despite repeated strikes by British and Dutch aircraft, the Japanese managed to land a significant number of troops and equipment. The RAF and RAAF launched multiple attacks on the landing barges, but the sheer number of Japanese vessels overwhelmed their efforts. During the night, an evacuation of Palembang was underway. The Japanese had control of P1, with troops and snipers stationed along the roads, but a Dutch roadblock was set up near Palembang to prevent any sudden Japanese advances into the city. Both military and civilian personnel evacuated Palembang, burning anything they couldn't take with them. They were transported across the Meuse River to safety, while the black smoke of burning buildings and the BPM oil refinery hovered over the city. At dawn on February 15, a delayed Dutch demolition charge exploded at the NPM refinery, causing significant damage and spreading fire. Meanwhile, P1 remained relatively quiet until 10:30 a.m. when a Japanese scout aircraft landed on the airfield. Major Komura informed the pilot that his troops were fighting with limited ammunition and captured weapons. The pilot returned to base with this information, prompting a reinforcement drop of arms and ammunition at 1 p.m. Japanese advance and securing of Palembang. Colonel Tsuchiya and his staff, emerging from the forest, were pleased with the progress made. Reinforcements arrived at Palembang airfield at 1:30 p.m., with 90 troops from Lieutenant Morisawa's 3rd Rifle Company landing directly on the airfield. They were soon supplied with additional weapons and ammunition. Lieutenant Adachi led a platoon towards Palembang, encountering minimal resistance. By 5:30 p.m., they found the city partially on fire and undefended. 2 Dutch patrol boats, P-39 and P-40, were discovered, with one disabled and the other fleeing upriver. Lieutenant Morisawa secured Palembang with his detachment, while communications were established with forces at the oil refineries. The 229th Infantry Regiment was transported to Palembang by evening, where the paratroopers welcomed them. On February 20, the 38th Infantry Division took command of Sumatra's capital from the paratroopers. Aftermath and assessments. The paratroopers claimed to have destroyed numerous anti-aircraft weapons, armored cars, and trucks, and to have inflicted significant casualties on the Dutch and RAF defenders. However, these figures were likely exaggerated. The Japanese reported losing 2 transport planes and a medium bomber during the first combat drop. Of the 339 paratroopers, 29 were killed, 37 seriously injured, and 11 had minor injuries, a loss rate of about 23%. Historians have classified the raid on P1 and the oil refineries as both successful and unsuccessful. Initially, U.S. intelligence reports in 1942 declared the operation unsuccessful, exaggerating the number of Japanese attackers and claiming most were killed or captured. However, historians later corrected these errors, recognizing that the Japanese did manage to secure vital oil supplies, despite not achieving all their objectives. By February 24, the 38th Infantry Division controlled a large portion of southern Sumatra, with Japanese bombers and aircraft operating from P1. The remaining Dutch defenders retreated to the northwest, where they continued a guerrilla war. Around 2,000 Dutch soldiers surrendered on March 28, 1942, solidifying Japanese control over Sumatra. Jean-Eric Lair, a social studies teacher and retired university police officer from Bensonville, Illinois, authored the detailed account of the raid. Living in River Grove, Illinois, he has written 4 books, including Blossoming Silk Against the Rising Sun, U.S. and Japanese Paratroopers in the Pacific in World War II.